18 years is long enough to stop asking questions. Long enough to trust the silence in a marriage the way you trust the floor under your feet. My name is Daniel Cole. I was 44 years old, and I had spent half my life building a logistics company out of a single leased box truck and a phone number I answered myself at midnight. Nobody handed me anything. I earned every square foot of the warehouse I owned, every contract, every dollar. My wife, Melissa, was the person I built it for. We met in our 20s, when she was working the front desk at a hotel downtown and I was hauling furniture for extra cash. She had this way of making a room feel warmer just by walking into it. People trusted her instantly. I did too. We had 2 kids, Ryan, 23, finishing his MBA 2 states away, and Emma, 19, in her 2nd year of college. From the outside, we were the couple people pointed to as proof that it could still work. What they didn't see were the 16-hour days, the missed dinners, the years I spent building something so my family would never feel what I felt growing up broke. I didn't complain. That was the deal I made with myself a long time ago. Something had shifted in Melissa over the last year, though, and I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a house before you find the open window. She started a pottery class on Thursday nights, something she'd never once mentioned wanting to do in 18 years of marriage. She bought a new perfume, something floral and expensive, and stopped wearing the one I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. Her phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter, started living in her purse, in her hand, in her pocket, anywhere but somewhere I might glance at it. One evening I came home early and found her laughing at something on her screen, the kind of laugh that catches in your throat when it stops too fast. She told me it was a work email, something funny a coworker sent about a client. I let it go because I told myself 18 years bought a person the benefit of the doubt. She said the pottery studio had a small billing glitch that had charged her card twice at a boutique hotel spa across town. A strange mix-up, she said, some kind of shared vendor account the studio used for a wellness partnership. It sounded thin even as she said it, but I nodded because that was easier than the alternative. Once I started paying attention, I couldn't stop finding things. She'd taken up running, she said, which was why she started leaving the house at 6 in the morning 3 days a week. But her sneakers never came back dusty and her hair never came back damp. She picked up new clients for her marketing firm who required her to travel for site consultations, weekend trips to conferences that never seemed to have a website or an agenda I could find when I looked. She started sleeping with her phone plugged in on her nightstand instead of the kitchen charger we'd used for a decade. Little changes, small enough that any one of them meant nothing. Together they added up to a woman quietly rebuilding her life around something she didn't want me to see. I watched all of it happen and said almost nothing, because I've never been a man who accuses without proof, and because some stubborn part of me still wanted to be wrong. 3 weeks before Emma's 20th birthday, Melissa asked me for the 10th time to finally clean out the attic crawl space above our garage, the place where we'd been dumping boxes since we bought the house. I picked a Saturday afternoon when she was out at her studio and started hauling things down, sorting decorations from junk from things worth keeping. Behind an old box of Ryan's Little League trophies, wedged between the wall stud and a stack of flattened moving boxes, I found a fireproof lockbox I didn't recognize. It wasn't locked. The latch had rusted loose years ago and never been replaced. Inside, under a folder of old tax documents, was a spiral notebook with a plain black cover. No label, the pages swollen slightly from humidity. I almost set it aside without opening it. Then I noticed my own name on the first line I could see through the warped pages, and something in my chest went cold before I even had the cover fully open. The first entry was dated a little over 2 years earlier, and the first sentence read like a door slamming somewhere deep in the house. If Daniel ever found out what I've actually been doing, he'd never look at me the same way again. I sat down on an overturned box in that dusty crawl space and read for the next 40 minutes without moving. It wasn't a diary about one mistake or one bad night. It was a record, methodical and detailed, of a life she had been living alongside the one I thought we shared. The first name that appeared was Marcus Bennett, a man who owned a boutique hotel on the east side of town, the same hotel whose spa had supposedly double-charged her card. According to her own words, there had been nothing accidental about those charges. There were entries about rented rooms, about texts deleted the moment I walked into a room, about excuses rehearsed in the car before she came inside. Then came another name, Derek Holloway, a financial advisor she'd met at a networking event, married, a daughter close to Emma's age. The entries described him with the same casual detachment as Marcus, as if neither man mattered beyond what he offered her in the moment. By the middle of the notebook, I'd lost count of the names. Some entries spanned weeks, some barely lasted a page before she moved on to someone new. What stopped me cold wasn't the affairs themselves. It was the way she wrote about me in between them. Daniel thinks the warehouse and the trucks make him someone. He talks about margins and freight lanes like anyone's supposed to be impressed. Half the time I wonder if he's ever had an original thought outside of a spreadsheet. Page after page, she picked apart the exact things I'd sacrificed to give her the life she was living, mocking the hours, mocking the exhaustion, mocking the version of me that had spent 2 decades making sure she never had to worry about a bill again. That was the part that didn't just hurt, it recalibrated everything. It told me who she actually was underneath 18 years of mornings and holidays and shared decisions. Then I found the section that turned my stomach in a completely different way. It was dated for a point roughly 5 months in the future, and it wasn't venting, it wasn't fantasy, it was a plan. Melissa intended to leave right after Emma's spring semester ended, once both kids were settled and less likely, in her words, to need her physically present. She'd already toured 2 apartments across town. She'd already spoken to a divorce attorney for a consultation she'd paid for in cash. And she hadn't planned to walk away with nothing. There were entries about a separate account she'd opened at a bank we didn't use, and a running log of transfers she'd been quietly pulling from our joint accounts and, more troubling, from a shared investment fund tied to my company that she had signing authority over as an emergency backup from years earlier. Never large enough at once to trigger questions, 600 here, 1100 there, spread out over almost 2 years. It had added up to more than I wanted to calculate sitting in that crawl space. The final entry was dated 4 days before I found the notebook. 5 more months and I'm out. Daniel's too busy playing businessman to ever look up long enough to notice. I sat there a long time after reading that line. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't change. What I felt wasn't rage. It was something colder and steadier. A kind of clarity I hadn't expected. She thought she had outmaneuvered me for 2 years. She had, until the moment she left the entire blueprint of her plan sitting 8 feet above my garage. The next morning she sat across from me at the breakfast table exactly as she had 1,000 mornings before, same routine, same easy warmth in her voice when she asked about my day. I answered normally, told her I had a busy stretch coming up at the warehouse, which was true in a different sense than she understood. For the next several weeks I became extremely busy, though not in any way she would have guessed. The first call I made was to my attorney, a sharp, unhurried man named Walter Briggs who had handled every major contract for my company for over a decade. I laid the notebook on his desk and let him read through it in silence. When he finally looked up, he asked if it was all real. I told him every page was. He leaned back and said something I'd remember for a long time, that some people apparently prefer to document their own downfall in longhand. I told him I needed a plan. He told me I needed protection first and the plan would follow. Within days his forensic accountant had traced the outside account back to its origin and mapped the pattern of transfers against the fund records at my company. Nothing about it was going to land her in criminal trouble. The amounts were structured just carefully enough to stay under most reporting thresholds, but it painted an unmistakable picture of premeditation. A spouse quietly preparing an exit funded in part by money that was never fully hers to move. While that work happened in the background, I made quieter changes of my own, restructuring signing authority on the company accounts, reviewing every piece of paperwork tied to the business, making sure that whatever happened next, 18 years of building something from nothing wasn't going to be handed away through a loophole she'd counted on nobody noticing. At home, Melissa noticed nothing. If anything, she seemed lighter, almost giddy in a way I hadn't seen from her in years, which made sense now in a way it hadn't before. One night she came down the stairs in a new dress I didn't recognize, asked how she looked, and I told her expensive, which she laughed off as not being an actual answer. 10 minutes later her phone buzzed and her whole face changed. That same fast, private smile I'd caught her wearing in the kitchen months earlier. She told me she had a client dinner running late and wouldn't be back until after 10. I watched her drive off and then went straight to the notebook again, and found an entry I'd missed the first time through, mentioning a third man, a business consultant named Nathan Reyes she'd met through her firm, who apparently believed she'd be filing for divorce before the holidays. It was almost funny in the worst way. Every man in that notebook believed he was part of some different version of her future, and not one of them knew about the others, and none of them knew about me watching all of it unfold from the outside now. I decided the reveal wouldn't wait for her carefully scheduled spring departure. Ryan was coming home for a long weekend to celebrate finishing his final semester of business school early, and Melissa had already started planning a dinner to market at a restaurant downtown with a private room she loved, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the river. She'd booked it herself, thinking it would be a proud, ordinary family night. I let her keep planning it. I made one edition of my own. I had 20 copies of that notebook professionally printed and bound, cover blank except for her name across the front. No explanation needed once anyone opened the first page. The dinner started exactly as she expected. My parents arrived first, then hers, Harold and Diane, people who had spent 2 decades treating Melissa like the daughter who'd finally settled down and done everything right. Emma showed up from campus glowing with pride for her brother. Ryan arrived last, in a good mood, already talking about job offers. Melissa's younger sister, Claire, came in laughing about traffic. The room filled with the kind of easy warmth that comes before people know what's about to happen to it. Melissa sat at the head of the table beside me, radiant, thinking this night belonged entirely to her son and, in some private corner of her mind, to the countdown she thought only she knew about. About an hour into dinner, once the toasts to Ryan had wound down and the room had settled into comfortable conversation, I stood and asked for everyone's attention. I told them that 18 years ago Melissa and I had built something together, a family, a home, a life that from the outside looked like it had figured everything out. I told them I wanted the people at this table, the people who loved us most, to understand exactly what that life had actually been built on. Then I reached beside my chair, lifted the box onto the table, and began passing a bound copy to each person, one at a time, starting with her parents. The room went quiet the way a room goes quiet right before something breaks. Melissa's face lost color the instant she saw her own name on the cover. She told me to stop, that whatever this was, it was private, that I had no right. I told her she was right, that it was private, and that was exactly the problem. Harold opened his copy first, and I watched a man who had defended his daughter through every criticism anyone had ever leveled at her slowly go pale as he turned page after page. Diane read over his shoulder and put a hand to her mouth. Claire stopped breathing for a moment, staring at an entry describing one of the men by name, someone she apparently recognized from Melissa's office. Ryan read in complete silence, his jaw tightening with every page, and Emma, sitting closest to me, reached the entry describing the timeline for Melissa's planned departure. The phrase built around waiting until the kids were settled and less likely to need her, and her hands started shaking so badly she had to set the book down. Nobody needed to ask what any of it meant. It was all there in Melissa's own handwriting, dates, names, amounts, intentions, laid out with the same careless honesty she'd apparently only ever shown to a notebook. Harold asked her, quietly, if it was true. She looked away instead of answering, and that silence told everyone at the table everything they needed to know. Diane started crying without a sound. Claire looked at her sister like she was seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. Ryan closed his copy, set it down deliberately, and told her, in a voice far steadier than mine would have been at his age, that he needed time, maybe a long time, before he could look at her the same way again. Emma didn't say anything at all. She simply stood up and left the private room, and after a moment Ryan followed her out. Melissa turned on me then, told me I was enjoying humiliating her in front of everyone she loved. I told her humiliation fades. What she'd built didn't. I pulled a folder from beside my chair and set it on the table beside the notebooks, bank statements and transfer records spilling across the white tablecloth, the outside account, the pattern of withdrawals from the company fund she'd had access to for years. Her father picked up one of the statements, read it, and set it down like it had burned him. He stood up slowly, looking a decade older than he had when he walked in, and told her that he had spent years defending her judgment to anyone who questioned it, and asked her, almost gently, how long she had been planning to become this. She had no answer for that either. One by one the table emptied. Nobody hugged her on the way out. Nobody took her side. By the time the room was down to just the two of us, there was nothing left to say that the notebook hadn't already said for her. The divorce filing went in 3 days later. Walter had everything ready before the ink on the dinner reservation had even cooled. The transfers, the outside account, the documented timeline of an affair spanning multiple men over more than 2 years. All of it became part of the record. What surprised me wasn't how fast the process moved. It was how quickly the men from those pages disappeared once consequences showed up at their own doors. Marcus stopped returning her calls within a week. Derek suddenly rediscovered an interest in repairing things with his wife. Nathan decided he wasn't in a place for anything serious after all. Every one of them had been perfectly comfortable being part of her secret life right up until it stopped being secret. By the time the settlement was finalized 7 months later, Melissa walked away with exactly what the law required and not a dollar more. No sympathy arrangement, no reward for 2 years of careful planning. The house stayed with me. The company stayed intact, structured the way Walter and I had quietly rebuilt it months earlier specifically to withstand this. The money she tried to hide became a liability she had to explain to her own attorney instead of a cushion for her new life. Whatever future she'd imagined for herself in that notebook, it hadn't included losing custody of her own family's trust the way she did that night at the restaurant. A year after everything came apart, the house felt different in a way I hadn't expected, quieter, but lighter, the kind of quiet that comes from nothing being hidden anymore. Ryan finished his MBA and took a job 2 hours away, close enough to visit most months, though he still hadn't found a way to have a real conversation with his mother. He told me once that the affairs weren't even the part that stuck with him the longest. It was the way she'd written about all of us in between, the contempt underneath the ordinary days. I told him I understood exactly what he meant, because it was the same thing that had stayed with me. You can forgive a mistake. Contempt is different. Once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. Emma finished her 2nd year of college and came home for the summer quieter than she used to be, though steadier too, in a way that suggested she was working her way through something on her own timeline. One evening she mentioned that her mother had reached out again, asking to talk, and I asked what she'd decided. She told me she'd let the message sit unanswered for a week before finally deleting it without replying. There was no hesitation in the way she said it. The wound was still there, it just wasn't running the show anymore. As for Melissa, word moved through our small enough circle of the city the way it always does, not because I said a single thing to anyone, but because people notice when a life falls apart in public at a restaurant with 20 witnesses. Her firm quietly let her go within a few months, citing client concerns that never got explained further than that. She eventually found work 2 towns over, longer hours, smaller title, none of the polish she'd built her identity around for years. I ran into her exactly once after that, in the parking lot of a supplier I used on the other side of town, and she asked for 1 minute of my time. I told her she'd had 18 years. She said she'd made mistakes. I told her mistakes were accidents, and what she'd done had taken 2 years of planning and a notebook full of proof. She didn't argue, because there was nothing left in her own handwriting that could argue for her. 2 years after I found that notebook in the crawl space, I was back up there over the garage, putting away holiday decorations, in a space that looked nothing like it used to, organized now, labeled, no forgotten corners left to hide anything. The lockbox was long gone by then, handed over as evidence and never returned. Not that I wanted it back. Emma called up the stairs to ask if I was coming down, since half the family had already arrived for the holidays and the house smelled like dinner. I came down to find my parents debating whose turn it was to host next year. Ryan telling some story from his new job that had Emma laughing so hard she had to set her drink down. The whole house full in a way that felt earned rather than performed. At some point that evening my phone buzzed with a message from Claire, a short update that Melissa had moved apartments again. Another town, another restart. I read it once and put the phone away, because it didn't change anything about the life sitting in front of me at that table. Melissa had spent 2 years believing she was the only one who understood the full shape of her own story, believing that 18 years of marriage made her untouchable, believing the safest place in the world for the truth was a notebook tucked behind a stack of moving boxes nobody would ever think to move. She was wrong on every count. She hadn't lost her family because I exposed her. She'd lost them the moment she started building a second life out of the wreckage of the first one entry at a time, in her own hand. All I ever did was open a cover she thought would stay closed forever, and let everyone in that room finally read the ending she'd already written for herself.